Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Joyride. So, IMDb is to call this movie an action mystery thriller. I can understand the thriller part, like, that seems to be obvious. The paranoia of the characters, the build of the story, but can't understand the real mystery of this film. The only real mystery is maybe who is on the other side of the conversation that both Fuller and Lewis are to have in this film. Who could he be? But then the action part, I'm just like, man, like for a road trip movie to be said to be in the action genre, a little confused. But so, I have to admit also that this movie is to blatantly rip off Duel. I'll admit that this movie feels too much like Duel. Um, but this also, like, this movie does remind me of the very first Jeepers Creepers movie, because the first Jeepers Creepers movie uh, feels more like a road trip kind of film. We have two people in a small car, and there is to be a much bigger vehicle consistently following them, and comes off as to be similar to that. This movie also, as far as concept, reminds me of Phone Booth, where you have the guy who's stuck in the phone booth talking to this mysterious man, uh, finding things about one another, and eventually, if Colin Farrell is to try to leave this phone booth, he'll end up getting shot and killed. Yeah, Phone Booth is a pretty good movie. Um, and so now that I've gone on and blatantly pointed out all the obvious things here, or not so obvious, now this movie is very cringe. After rewatching this film, didn't exactly realize how cringe this movie was. And so that really comes off via me watching this and just be like, no. Don't go on and don't do this prank because I don't like prank films. I really don't. Um, because when really looking at it, you may be on the bad side of the prank at some point, and I just don't like prank movies. I just don't. Um, but so with this film, beyond all the negative things that I just said, I really like this film. I like it. I like this. I like the story because, of course, the paranoia of these characters really sell us on this film. Um, how we have these people who don't know what this guy looks like, so he can be anybody. So it's just the build of these guys just thinking like, oh no, like I think that could be the guy. Oh no, I think that could be the person. And the build of the film of this guy who is to, of course, he's watching us. I think that is to be the main thing that they ended up putting in the trailer, and that was like the catchphrase of the movie. He's watching us was the whole like kit and caboodle of this movie. So now that I've gone on and said that, for a road trip movie, I can't go on and say that this is a great film, but I would say that it's like roughly, like, I think it's a good film. Like this, like what ends up happening to here, the build of the movie, um, like I can go on and watch this movie again at some point and like still think that it has rewatchable value, and I don't think it's hard to like go through this whole film and also like feel bored throughout it. No, so I like this road trip film. This is probably one of the top best road trip movies. Um, out of probably the ones that I've gone on and seen. But anyways, so let's tee up. What is this movie about? So we have Lewis, who is to be consistently calling this girl named Venna. And so Lewis, who is Paul Walker in this movie, is to eventually decide to go on this road trip, and that road trip also leads him to meet up with his older brother who is in jail, and Lewis is to go on and get his brother to bring him back home. And so Lewis is consistently talking to Fuller about home and like if he misses it and so on and so forth. So, but eventually this comes to a head when both of these guys go on and try to repair this car, and Fuller decides to go and get a CB radio to then talk to some of the truckers. So we have at one point where Fuller starts to pretend that he is somebody to go on and question if there is any cops in the road. But then, the further and further we go into this film, these two characters decide to pick this one guy and prank him to eventually have him come to this one location to see where this story heads further. Come to find out, this story ends up going far too far, and Fuller and Lewis didn't realize where this would really head. And so Fuller and Lewis end up regretting what they had done, and these two characters consistently think that this story is going to get resolved and wrapped up, and they can just go on and toss out this CB radio or eventually just stop talking to this guy. And come to find out, the tale ends up turning when this guy in the semi truck is to follow both Fuller and Lewis and try to prank them. Prank them to the point where it seems like this is never going to end until Rusty Nail is to go on and prank these people to death. So, a road trip movie then ends up turning sideways, where at some points we have a number of these guys that just want this thing to end, but it just keeps on going. So, with that said, yeah, you guys can go on and check this movie out on Hulu, Hulu. That is where this movie is conveniently. And so, with that said, I think it's about that time to just go on into spoilers, to just kind of cover what ends up happening in more detail about this film. Let me know how you felt about this film, whether you like this movie, where this is on your top 10 films. Oddly enough, I think a lot of people like Joyride. And so it's kind of interesting to kind of realize a movie like this is to have gone on so well. But also, when really thinking about it, like once Paul Walker did pass away, it seems that Paul Walker movies like have really just gone on to like be these big films. And even so, every one of them, regardless, were to, for the most part, eventually be these franchise films. Like Joyride eventually did go on and make sequels. And so, anyways, let's go on and let's double fire this bad boy up, because I think it's about that time to otherwise go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about the time we spoil this movie. So, in the very beginning of the film, we of course have Lewis, who is in this dorm room, and he is talking to Venna at 3 in the morning. And we of course have Lewis's roommate, who is telling Lewis, it's like, well, hey man, like it's 3 in the morning, I have a final tomorrow, and Lewis is to chuck this guy the CD player. Guys, remember CD players? Probably still have one. You probably just only like, no man, I'm not going to conform and get an iPod and whatever. Like nowadays, I think everybody just kind of listens to music on their phone. That's what I do. I just go into YouTube and just kind of search a random song that has like an hour on repeat, and I just kind of do that for listening to music whenever I need it. But so Lewis is to go on and talk to Venna, and eventually, what comes up is that Venna wants a person with a car to come and get her, and Lewis is to realize he had this like refundable ticket and to meet this girl because he wants to finally meet with her and get with her. But Lewis instead is like, you know what? Like, I got a car. Like, how about we make a whole road trip out of this? So Venna's like, are you serious? You have a car? And so Lewis is to go on and find this used car lot. And I can't help but think in my brain that in the background of this scene, that the guy who ends up playing Fuller is somehow in the background of this movie, in this scene, oddly enough. I could be wrong about that. It feels like he has like his hair like slicked, but I feel like he's somewhere in that scene, bizarrely. So Lewis is to find this one vehicle, and he ends up buying it. So cue us going on to have Lewis, who eventually is to get a call from his mother, stating that his brother is to be in trouble again, and so Lewis goes to this police station to try to pick up his brother. So Fuller ends up realizing that his brother is there, and he's like, "Oh my God! Like you're taller than me, and you're older now," and so on and so forth. So Lewis picks up his brother, and eventually Lewis is to tell Fuller about this whole road trip that he has planned, and so on and so forth. So both of them go into this repair shop, and Fuller just weirdly wants to go on and get this antenna installed in a CB radio. And Lewis is like, "Why did you do all this?" And Fuller's like, "Well, yeah, I got a great deal out of it." And Lewis is like, So we have Fuller, who is to be pretending that he is this black sheep character. And so eventually we have Rusty Nail, who is to mention about the weather and how eventually ends up saying that, no, I'm not doing the voice right. Eventually saying, God, I'm not really doing it right. I probably could have done it really good before. But anyways, so Rusty Nail is going on and mentioning about the weather and about it raining and how it kind of keeps everybody inside. And they're just like, who the is this guy? This guy is weird. So we have Fuller, who's deciding that Lewis is going to have to go on and play this female character because at some point they had gone on and done this prank previously where Lewis had been really young and sounded like he could pull off a girl's voice anyways. So and now like it seems that Lewis can still figure out how to sound like a female, maybe, question mark. So Lewis goes on and does this female voice, and she, of course, Lewis is to be, of course, Candy Cane temporarily. So Fuller is to pretend that he is to be this black sheep character, and that he's going to go on and meet her, and so on and so forth. Then Lewis is also looking for uh, the Rusty Nail guy to go on and talk to him. So Lewis is to eventually get Rusty Nail on the thing, on the channel. And so Lewis then is to do this whole story about, like, you know what I like to think about? Like, I like to think about that somebody's right next to me, even though they aren't. And so Lewis is to start to get through some points of this story where I probably can't go on and say them via here, but we start to have them play out scenarios of what would happen if they were both in the same location together and clothes are being taken off and so on and so forth. So all of a sudden they end up losing this guy on the radio, and so they're like, oh, okay, well, that ends that. So they go on and have both Fuller and Lewis. Fuller goes to this hotel, where of course we have this attendant here who has a upset customer. And so this upset customer is to be upset because, like, this guy hasn't slept for 2 days, and once he goes into this hotel, there is to be people that consistently bug him about towels or blankets or whatever. And so this guy hasn't slept for a number of days, but there is no way for him to consistently get any kind of real sleep with everybody continuing to barge into his place. So Fuller finally is to interrupt this guy to try and get rooms for himself and Lewis. So, like, to get one room for the both of them. And this guy's going to be like, hey man, like, I'm talking to this guy here, and this guy is being blatantly rude anyways, to this hotel attendant. So eventually this guy is such an a-hole that he is to kind of smash shoulder to shoulder with Fuller, and Fuller's like, God, that guy. So come to find out that this guy is in room 17. So Fuller and Lewis end up getting room 18 right next to this guy. And so Lewis, while waiting for Fuller to come back, is to notice that Rusty Nail is on the radio. So Lewis is to tell Fuller, hey, this guy is back. So Fuller is to tell Lewis to have this guy come to this hotel and go into room 17 and bring pink champagne because it's supposedly Lewis's character's favorite, the candy cane character. So Fuller and Lewis both go to the room next door to listen and wait for what is to happen. And so Rusty Nail is to make his way to this place. And so there is to be this conversation that is to be kind of barely being had here. Half of the time I'm kind of listening, but most of the time I'm reading the subtitles. You can kind of see, like, some of the dialogue is to actually be said in the subtitle part. About Rusty Nail asking if this guy is Black Sheep, or is to go on and talk about, like, the champagne, and the other guys mention it's like, well, this is some joke, right? So Fuller and Lewis are to mention that they thought they heard a thud, or that they thought they heard some choking sound. They weren't quite sure. Lewis ends up going on to call the motel or hotel attendant to see if there's anything wrong going on in that room. And so they go on and do so. And the person who picks up the phone is Rusty Nail, and he ends up saying that everything is fine. And so they end up getting a phone call, both Lewis and Fuller, into their room, and the person ends up repeating what Rusty Nail had said. So, and then Lewis repeats that to Fuller. So they're like, okay, well, like then, like we'll just go on and we'll just get out of here within the next day. So the next day, come to find out, we have Fuller who is being questioned by this police officer, and so Fuller is to mention that he heard some kind of noises, but he wasn't sure what it exactly was. And so, come to find out, the guy in the next room had been put in a coma as his jaw had been ripped off, and like he had been like really badly hurt and been kind of dropped in this certain location. So, because the officer ends up taking both Fuller and Lewis to this guy, to his body, and so eventually they go on to break it to the sheriff, I believe, at some point. They had gone on and done this whole prank, and the sheriff, who a lot of people know as the guy who plays Bobby on Supernatural, or if you guys have gone on and seen The Boys, he'll be Robert Singer in the Boys as this senator character, who actually is Jim Beaver. And the sheriff is like, oh my god, like, you know how much like stuff that I'm gonna go on and have to do because you guys had just decided to go on and pull this prank. So, not to mention like how they're going to be able to catch this guy because it's a random stranger that these guys only know has a BC radio and might own a semi truck. So we have Fuller and we have Lewis, and so this is a thing that just kind of continues. This continues to go on here. So we have at first where Fuller and Lewis go on to, when talking to this guy, finally admit this was all a prank and this was all a lie. And Black Sheep and Candy Cane are really real people. And Lewis is to go on and tell this semi-truck driver, it's like, well, yeah, you know how I can get rid of you? I can just adjust my dial and turn you off. And so eventually come to find out, Rusty Nail is to tell both Fuller and Lewis that, like, hey, you know what, you should go on and fix that. And they're like, what? And they're like, your tail light. It's like, oh no, he knows our tail light is broken, oh my god. So they realize they're being followed, and so they're driving like crazy, and we have Lewis who realizes that they're almost on E as far as gas goes, and so Fuller just decides, like, well, hey, how about we just go and take this exit, and we'll go to this gas station, and we'll call the police. So Lewis tries to go into this gas station to call this police, and we have this truck driver who has this weird looking, like, small bat, and he has this ice truck, and so he goes on to go into this gas station and start poking around. And so Lewis is to try to call police, but by the time that the guy goes in there, Fuller is to kind of like, he's pointing, and so Lewis is like, oh my god, this might be the guy. So Lewis tries to go on and give this girl his credit card, try to quickly sign for things and walk off, and both of them quickly get into the car and try to get the heck out of there. So we all of a sudden have this truck who is following behind Lewis and Fuller, and so they're like driving crazily off the road. They're taking all these back roads till eventually they hit this dead end. And so Fuller and Lewis are like, oh my god, this guy's going to kill us, this guy's going to attack us. And Fuller is to mention that they have a gun, and this truck driver ends mentioning that he has a credit card. Because evidently Lewis was to go on and forget his credit card, and so this guy would have thought to do the right thing and give Lewis back his credit card. And so he's like, "Oh wow, like thank you, man. Like you almost like gave us a heart attack, but like thanks, man. Thanks for doing the right thing." And so he's like, "Well, is it because of the mustache?" And Fuller's like, "No, because he had like that odd bat." And the truck driver's like, "Oh, like the bat is just to like smack my tires to just kind of see if there's like pressure for them that needs to like if they need to eventually get adjusted." And Fuller's like, "Oh, all right then." So they end up getting out of there, and so eventually they hope at this point that like this prank is possibly be done, but it still isn't. Um, because eventually what happens is we have both Fuller and Lewis who have this semi truck going after them, and they end up driving this car, and they end up driving it almost into this tree. They swerve at the perfect time, but then they end up getting stuck next to this tree because they're kind of getting kind of their tires to just like they're pushing back and forth and they can't go anywhere. So what happens finally is Fuller is to go on to the CB radio and is to apologize and say he's sorry. It's like hey man, this is all just a joke and it's gone too far. And so Rusty Nail goes on and tells him it's like, well, hey man, like yeah, I'm just pulling a prank on you guys too. Like this is really funny. And so cuz we now have the semi that is to basically start to push this car against this tree, and the car is starting to tilt, and these guys, both Fuller and Lewis, are thinking they're going to die, and so they have to admit that they're finally sorry. And so the semi truck backs up and lets the car be and lets them get out of there. And so Fuller takes the CB radio and chucks it out of the car because they're like, we're done with this now. So they don't even want to be tempted by the CB radio. So Fuller and Lewis are to have this moment where Lewis is to tell Fuller, it's like, hey, don't mention any of this story to Venna. Like, I don't want to freak her out. And, like, I just want to, like, just try to make the best of this. So, Fuller and Lewis meet with Venna, and all of a sudden we end up having this girl who is driving by who is to be Venna's friend. They end up having this heart to heart together because Venna is saying that Charlotte will be their or Venna will be Charlotte's roommate next year for classes. So Charlotte drives off, and Fuller was trying to hit on her and do all these kinds of things because Fuller is immediately thinking that like Venna is to be Lewis's girl, but the more and more that Lewis does not go on and try to like pull the trigger here, the more that we have Fuller who's like, well, maybe I should try to like get with this girl if Lewis isn't. But it seems that Venna is also like thinking that Lewis is going to pull the trigger also, but it just never really happens for this film. And you would think after the way that this movie ends, like it would probably never happen again. Just be like, yeah, we are never going on a road trip ever together. So we take off here, and so Venna is now with the boys, and eventually what happens is we make it to this hotel where the three of them are to get very drunk at this bar, and we have all three of them go back to their rooms. And Fuller is to say it's like, well, he's not quite drunk enough yet, as it seems that Lewis has gotten too drunk and he is to be seemingly snoring away within his room, as Fuller is to go on and be watching adult movies. And so Fuller goes to Vienna's room and is to say that he's a licensed bartender, but his license, he can't get to it because his hands are full with all this alcohol. So Vienna is asking Fuller, it's like, well, hey, like, where is your other half? Where is your brother? And Fuller's like, well, he's passed out, he's tired. And so Fuller and Vienna are to go on and continue to get drunk. And Lewis is to have his phone ring. And so Lewis is trying to get Fuller to answer the phone, but Fuller is not in his room. So Lewis answers the phone to eventually find that Rusty Nail is to know exactly what's going on within this hotel, how now Lewis is to have a female with them, and it's like, well, hey, like, you guys told me that you didn't have a female with you, but you have one now. And Rusty Nail is to mention how Fuller is now in Vienna's room, and hey, what's going on with that? Because we have a moment, of course, where Fuller had fallen asleep, and both Lewis and Vienna are talking, and they're kind of having this really nice moment, to the point where Fuller wakes up at the worst time and is to say, it's like, yeah, this is the moment where you two kiss. You know, like, historically, like, this is where it happens. And so they don't, because they realize that they've been technically blocked here by Fuller, who has woken up and ruined the moment. So, like, we have these characters that end up getting so close to things. Plus, we have, like, Vienna, it seems, through most of this movie, who, like, you can honestly, like, you can see the girl's chest through whatever shirt that she's wearing, like, as if she's obviously throughout this whole entire movie not wearing a bra through most of this film. And, like, I don't know if that was just, like, a choice of the film, or maybe that was just a choice of the actress who's like, no, I just don't have bras for whatever reason. Or maybe that was just like, oh no, like, maybe the people were to say, like, hey, could you go on and do this movie without one? Because maybe that'll sell this movie better. Because weirdly enough, that goes on in some movies, to, like, they have to go on and ask the actress of how they're going to go on and look throughout these films, and so on and so forth, bizarrely, because that's always, like, contracted in the film also, weirdly enough. So movies are weird. So we then have Lewis rushing to the room, stating, like, he's watching us, like, he know what happened, he's watching us. And Fuller and Lewis are thinking that they're going to need to just get out of here and run away. And Vienna is just like, how scared should I be here? And Fuller is saying, like, yeah, you should be more scared than you should be. As, of course, we go on to have Rusty Nail going and trying to call this other room, and so on and so forth. So we have the three of them all get in this car and they drive off, to have Fuller seeing these signs as he's driving by them. He's like, huh. So every single sign ends up saying, look inside the trunk, in not that exact wordage, but so Fuller decides to, like, stop and say, like, hey, all those signs said look inside the truck, Lewis. So they look inside the trunk, because eventually Vienna is to open the trunk, because the two other guys are thinking, like, what if a head is in there? What if a bomb is in there? What if Magoo is in there? What if anything could happen? So Venna opens the trunk, and it's just the CB radio for them to continue on this conversation. So come to find out, we now realize the Rusty Nail is to have Charlotte in his semi truck. Now the story has escalated. Oh my god. So now both Fuller and Lewis are to have to go to this diner and go into there without clothes on and have to order like 30 burgers and this and that. And so eventually we have the two go on and do this, and kind of curious if either one of them had like a double. Like, people could have butt doubles. It could be the case of or scenario. Some people might not be comfortable with basically showing the rears. Um, but so we have Fuller and we have Lewis who make their way into this diner, and we have, I think, like the manager going on and like, well, hey, this is a good fraternity prank, but the whole thing of it is, it's like, this would be a good prank if it wasn't my diner, so what are you guys trying to pull here? So Fuller and Lewis are trying to mention what is going on here, why they had to do this prank, and eventually they realize that they need to go on to run off to their vehicle to try to get out of here to redress themselves. And so eventually what happens in this story is Lewis and Fuller also explained everything to Venna, and she tries to reason with Rusty Nail. But so I believe when Fuller and Lewis make their way back to the car, they realize that also Venna is now missing. So, or no, wait, no. My mistake. That happens a little bit later. Because Venna and Lewis and Fuller have to go near this like cornfield, and they end up having to get 100 paces from the car, and then the semi truck is to try to run them down, and so all three of them are running in the cornfield, and the guy in the truck ends up scooping up Venna, and when the guys end up getting back to the car, they realize that the car is on fire, and so Rusty Nail is going on and telling these guys that they need to make their way to this certain hotel to get to Venna. So now these guys are running like crazy, and it's like 7 miles to the nearest hotel. So Fuller and Lewis find this bar, and they end up going on to heart wiring one of these trucks. And so we have this very drunk guy who comes out of the bar who is to notice that these guys are trying to go on and get this car started. And it's like, hey man, sorry, my car's flooded. And it's like, yeah, that's because it's a Ford, or that's because it's a whatever. So the guys are trying to give him like, well, hey man, like, how about you just fully just shut it off, give it some time, and then start it again. But then Fuller ends up figuring out a way to hotwire the car and gets it started. And so they run off with the car, and the guy, who of course is to have actually driven the car, is to run up like, hey man, like, that's my truck, you took my truck. So Fuller and Lewis make their way to every hotel within in a like the closest hotels that they can find, and so they're going through every room 17 that they can find, and or for the most point, most of the room 17s are to all have certain occupants that aren't, of course, Venna. So finally, when they get to this one last hotel, we finally have Lewis and Fuller get to this room find out that the whole room is empty, and come to find out because Rusty Nail is in the next room. So, and also Venna is plastic wrapped in duct, or no, not duct taped. Plastic wrapped and like taped around her mouth, and there is a whole contraption tied to the shotgun. If someone is to open the door, Venna is to get killed here. So we have Lewis and Fuller that realize that Rusty Nail is calling them from this other room and saying that he's in this other room because he is to say, it's like, well, hey, like, I know what you guys did. You guys were in the very next room and you could hear everything because you put your ear to the wall, right? And so we have Lewis telling Fuller to go to the back part of this place to look through a window to see like what's going on in the room. So Fuller then goes on and does that, and is to realize that Rusty Nail, the guy who is supposed to be Rusty Nail, who really isn't, because the voice kind of gives it away, he bashes his way through this window to then grab Fuller and is to push him to where there is this pipe that ends up going through Fuller's leg, which eventually I don't think is the same pipe thing that you see Fuller ending up having upon his leg when they go on and have Lewis trying to detach Fuller from this fence. But so what is to happen here is we have the police being called. They, of course, are to go on to eventually start breaking through every one of these doors, trying to find if the killer is to be in any one of these rooms. Because, of course, the hotel attendant is dead. So they start breaking through all the doors, and they then realize that we, of course, have Venna, who is still tied up here. And so Paul goes on to rush to try to break free Venna from her possibly getting killed here. And it's at the last minute. So we then have to have Lewis, who frees Fuller from this fence. And so the cops are to go on and shoot this semi that is going to drive its way through this whole hotel room. And Venna, who is to now be with these police officers, are getting out of this place. And so we have Lewis, who ends up freeing Fuller from this pipe, and they end up kind of jumping off to the side. The semi ends up crashing through this fence and through this room. And so when they end up going into the semi, they see the Charlotte character, and they end up seeing that supposedly the truck driver was to be the guy who is to be the ice truck driver from before, which isn't really the guy. And they're like, oh yeah, like that guy that we saw before. Not the same guy. But so they're in this ambulance, and all of a sudden we hear over the CB radio Rusty Nail going on and asking about the weather and how it's going to rain. And so Paul goes on and tries to answer this radio, and that's how the movie just ends. And basically telling us that, like, Rusty Nail was to go on and have this story, but, like, there was to never really be a way for them to answer it and whatever, and so on and so forth. Like, there was to just be this replaying of this same line, and that's how the movies just end, and just tell us that there may be a sequel in store, which there eventually was. So, with that's it. And it probably wasn't the same voice guy either. But yeah, so with that said, I think I'm going to go on and get out of here. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything that I forgot about. I think I went on and covered most of the movie, I think for the most point, but there might have been a huge gap of something that I forgot about, or maybe something was out of the order of which the movie was to go on and be. It's fine. At the end of the day, I can say that I've seen this movie, and so that's all that really matters. And I still felt positive about the film. So, that said, goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.